How many people do you know who ate a whole food plant-based diet and ended up with a protein deficiency? How often have you heard of this happening?
Well, when it comes to protein, one of the things that a lot of people in the plant-based world say is, if you're looking at protein deficiencies, the hospital wards would be empty. There aren't any. And I think that's an overstatement, to be honest. So we don't see overt protein deficiency like we see in starving children in Africa, where they would have kwashiorkor with the distended, stomachs and very emaciated limbs. We are a nation where we generally have an abundance of food. But it doesn't mean that people can't get enough protein. So we do see that. And let me just give you an example. So generally, people get enough protein from plant foods under a couple of conditions. One is that they're eating enough calories. So if you're eating enough calories, chances are you'll get enough protein if you're eating mostly whole foods. Now what happens sometimes, and I've seen this on a number of occasions, is you'll see a teenager who gets excited about the environment, animal rights, and they don't have the knowledge about nutrition, and they shift from eating a kind of a fast food teenager diet with lots of soda pop, and they were eating burgers and fries and chips and all of that. And all they do is remove the meat and remove the milk. So they're not eating ice cream, and they're not drinking milk anymore, and they're not consuming burgers. So instead of the burger, they do a double order of fries and a pop. And they're having their granola bars, and they're eating all their junk foods. And in fact, they may not get enough protein, and they need a fair bit of protein as they're still growing. And then the other people we see sometimes not getting enough protein are people that are eating very high fruit diets and not putting them together very well. Because fruit tends to have fairly low amounts of protein, they may not get enough either. Now, we also see sometimes in seniors don't digest and absorb amino acids as well as younger adults. And in fact, in some countries, for example in Australia, people actually have a separate recommendation for people over 70. They need about 25% more protein than a younger adult to meet their needs. And the reason is just because of the lower ability to break down and absorb the amino acids. And so it gets tricky, because you've got an older gentleman who may have needed 60 grams as an adult male. Now all of a sudden he needs 80 grams. But he's not eating 2,800 calories anymore because he doesn't move as quickly. He doesn't need as many calories. All of a sudden he's only eating 2,000 calories. But he needs 20 grams more protein. And in these cases, we can actually see what we call sarcopenia, or muscle wasting, in older people that aren't getting enough protein. I have also seen a number of people who are into raw food diets, but they're eating, a diet that is fairly high in fat, lots of coconut products and so forth, where they may not be getting enough protein, and they start to they lose hair, and their skin becomes almost thin looking. Their bones start to get weaker. There are a number of things that happen because protein is a building block for the tissues that we build everything with, including our bones. And so they may not get enough protein. And so in all of these cases, the trick is not to all of a sudden start taking protein powders, but to recognize that in a whole food plant-based diet, you do want to be including legumes. You want to be including some of the higher protein choices in the various groups. So for example, things like hemp seeds or pumpkin seeds are very valuable. And so the point is, most people eating a whole food plant-based diet do absolutely fine. But there are cases, and young children as well, where they need more protein per pound of body weight. And so we need, because they consume smaller amounts of calories, we need to be a little more conscious of where their protein is coming from. And so really including the legumes and the seeds and some nuts and so forth in the diet. So not that it's difficult to do, but it's not impossible to not get enough protein.
How do we get enough vitamins, minerals, and trace minerals? How do we prevent shortages of specific vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, and other essential nutrients?
So, you know, the question of how do we get enough vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids and all of these things, you know, I can remember 30 years ago when I started in this field, and my goal was at that time to help people get this right. Because a failed vegan, especially a child, they don't get enough B12, they don't get enough iodine, they don't get enough calcium, whatever it is, sets us back 20 years. Because I'll tell you, it hits the headlines. Vegan child dies of B12 deficiency or has irreversible brain damage or whatever. And I've received calls from, you know, from lawyers who are representing vegan parents who are, you know, going to go to jail because their child died of malnutrition. And my goal in life, one of my major goals, especially early on in my career, was to create resources that would make this almost impossible for this to happen. I wanted to create guidelines that were pretty much foolproof. You couldn't blow it if you follow this guide. And that's why I've written so many books, like Becoming Vegan. You know, we started with Becoming Vegetarian, and then Becoming Vegan, and then the new Becoming Vegetarian, and then Becoming Vegan Comprehensive and Express Editions, the, you know, completely rewritten 10 years later, and so on and so on. And I think it's just so critical we get this right, because when we get it wrong, we become exhibit number one for why people are justified in eating meat. So we really need to take the time. Most of our nutrition education materials are geared towards omnivores. So as vegans or as plant-based eaters, even if you're not vegan, you need to take it upon yourself to get educated about how to do this correctly, especially if you're raising small children. And speaking of that, that's my next book. I just teamed with a pediatrician from San Francisco. Her name is Rashma Shah, and she is balanced, she is science-based, and she's a brilliant writer. And I'm really quite honored to be working with her, but to provide a resource for families. And so this is, you know, one of the things that my writing partner, Vasanto Molina, who I've done most of my books with, and I have done, is to create these food guides. Like we have national food guides, so we've created vegan or plant-based food guides where we tell you how many servings of fruits and vegetables and legumes and nuts and seeds and grains and then what are within each of these groups are your best calcium choices. How do you get enough calcium? And then there are some nutrients, even if you do all that, you may not get enough of. And those are vitamin D, iodine, essential fatty acids, and vitamin B12. And so how do we make sure that those are covered as well? And so just to, you know, summarize, eating the range of a variety of plant foods in the reasonable amounts, getting a source of B12, which the most reliable are supplements or B12 fortified foods. So like Red Star nutritional yeast or you know, fortified non-dairy beverages would be a reliable source. And then for, you know, for iodine, people can use seaweed in varying amounts. They can use some iodized salt, and I know people will cringe with that, but certainly it's a reliable source, and you can get iodized salts that don't contain the, you know, all of the things that people are trying to avoid. You need to read the label. and you want to keep sodium low. So for me, I would prefer to rely on a little sprinkle of kelp. All you need is about a 1/16 of a teaspoon, or a 1/10 of a teaspoon, depending. So it's a very small amount. You don't even taste it. You can sprinkle that. For people that love seaweeds, things like nori and dulse and wakame, those can be very reasonable choices as well. Now with iodine, the amounts we get vary depending on the soil, the amount in the soil. In many places in Europe, like Italy and the UK and Finland, the amounts in the soil are very low, and so those people need to be really, really ultra vigilant, because they're not going to be able to rely on fruits and vegetables and other plant foods much for their iodine. We can a little bit more in North America, but still the numbers, they're not concentrated sources. So, and then vitamin D, well, of course sunshine is the ultimate source, but the sunshine is, I think, provides us with so much more than vitamin D. It's just so critical to our health. But many of us live in places where we don't have access to warm sunshine in the winter months. And we don't all have the money to be going to Hawaii every second month. So we need to rely on some supplements or fortified foods in that case as well. And then with essential fatty acids, again, we have some plant foods that really offer more concentrated sources. And in the omega-3 family, it's seeds like chia and hemp and flax and then nuts like walnuts. And so just learning specifically how to do this, you can put it together fairly easily.
What's wrong with eating fish, assuming it came from healthy waters?
It's an interesting question, and if you look around the world at some of the healthiest people, the Okinawans ate fish, the Sardinians, the people in Ikaria, a lot of healthy people do include fish, and so then why wouldn't we want to eat it when there are some of the healthiest people in the world? A couple of things that people need to be aware of. For example, the Okinawans averaged a ½ an ounce of fish a day. That's about 15 grams for people who are on the metric scale. And so this is a very tiny amount of fish. It's not a lot. They might have eaten it twice a week and very small servings. And so I think people can be healthy eating small amounts of clean fish. The issues for me are several. Number one, that fish is only as clean as the water it's swimming in. And our oceans are becoming more and more contaminated. Fish is one of our main dietary sources. It is the main dietary source of mercury, and it's one of the main sources of persistent organic pollutants in our environment. Dioxins and PCBs and all of these things that we know are neurotoxins. And so that's an issue for sure. And then the other issue is we are raping the oceans. There were a group of scientists that predicted by 2048 there wouldn't be any fish stocks left to fish. It would all be fish farming because we are cleaning out the oceans. I remember a program about life in the ocean. The last 5 minutes of the program showed one of these huge nets that are dragged along the bottom of the ocean. Everything in the net brought back up to the surface, and they picked off the prawns. About 20% of the weight of what was there was prawns. The other 80% fell, they let die, and turtles and sharks and you name it, dead back to the bottom of the ocean. It's of no value to the shrimp industry. So we also need to think about how these fish are being caught and what we're doing in the process to our ocean ecosystems, which to me is a big issue. And then for people who are interested in the compassion piece, fish, we used to think they didn't feel or think or any of that stuff, and that's just not true. There's There's a man by the name of Jonathan Balcombe that is a researcher in this area, and he's written several books, and we are learning a lot about the sort of sensibilities, if you will, of these creatures that are living in the ocean, and I think that needs to be weighed in as well. So my personal preference is not to consume fish.
According to the best unbiased science, is there a clear relation between consuming eggs and heart disease, cancer, and diabetes?
Well, with eggs, there's actually a fair bit of evidence on both sides. I think a fair bit of the evidence on the favorable side that they're healthy comes from the egg industry, which isn't surprising. Some not so much, but I think the studies are fairly clear that that eggs do increase certainly diabetes risk, and that they can increase blood cholesterol levels because they're little cholesterol bombs. Now we know cholesterol from food doesn't impact blood cholesterol levels as much as we once thought, but it still does increase it to some degree. And so I think we need to be aware of that. And so, of course, if it's increasing blood cholesterol levels, it can be a contributing factor to cardiovascular disease. Now, there was an interesting study that came out, I think it was 2018, but this was a Harvard study, 130,000 individuals followed for about 3 decades. So this is a big cohort followed for a long period of time. And what these researchers looked at was if we replace just 3% of calories coming from animal protein and replace it with plant protein, what will that mean for mortality rates? And just to set the stage here, 60, or to give you some framework that's more practical, 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet, which is kind of standard for a lot of people, would be about 60 calories worth of animal protein. This is not a lot. If we take 3% of calories from animal protein, replace it with plant protein, what happens in terms of mortality? Well, if that animal protein comes from processed meat, we decrease mortality 34% if that processed meat is replaced with plant protein. That's a lot. If we take the animal protein and it's coming from eggs and replace it with plant protein, we reduce mortality by 19%. That's significant. So if it's unprocessed meat, it's 12%. If it's dairy, it's 8%. And if it's poultry or fish, it's 6%. So I think this is a pretty significant finding. Of all of the animal products that were assessed in that study, eggs came out number 2 right after processed meat in terms of how much mortality is increased by replacing that food with plant protein. I will pick scrambled tofu over scrambled eggs any day.
Why are so many authors claiming animal products should be included in a healthy diet? Have you read the books promoting keto, paleo, low-carb diets? Do they have science to support their claims?
So when it comes to things like paleo, keto, low-carb diets, I get it actually. I think the thinking is that refined carbohydrates are really unhealthy choices for people. And so in these diets, they're getting out a lot of the processed foods. And they're thinking, what did we eat, that sort of back in paleo times when we were strong and running miles and miles, and we were living on, these wild animals and wild plants. And if we could just get back to that, that would be beneficial. Now that's the paleo diet. The keto diet is more if you can get your body to run on this different fuel called ketones, which is we produce when we don't get hardly any carbohydrates in our diets, that's somehow preferable. And so these diets have become popular because people really like to eat meat. You see, plant foods are all high carbohydrate foods, with the single exception of nuts and seeds. So fruits are, 92% of calories from carbohydrates. Legumes and grains are 75%. Even non-starchy vegetables are 58-60% of calories from carbohydrates. So they're all, predominantly, the predominant macronutrient is carbohydrates, with the exception of nuts and seeds that might be in the range of 12-14% of calories from carbohydrates. They're mostly fat. But it's really impossible to have a plant-centered diet that's no carbohydrates, because plants are carbohydrates. The only foods that are carbohydrate-free, of course, are meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and pure oil is carbohydrate-free. Some dairy is very low in carbohydrates, like cream, and butter, of course, is carbohydrate-free. It's pure fat. And things like cheese, which are very high fat. They're much lower in carbohydrate than fluid milk. But even fluid milk is it's about 32 or 34% of calories from carbohydrate if it's 2% milk. The higher fat milks would be lower in carbohydrates. But so you get the picture. If you're eating plant foods, you're not going to be getting a low carbohydrate diet, because plants aren't low in carbohydrates. So a lot of these diets are very animal strong, meat heavy diets. And I have a lot of concern about these kinds of diets, and certainly in some of the books, Lauren Cordain and others who are paleo promoters are legitimate scientists, and they've looked, and much of what they're saying is we need to get rid of the processed foods, and they're absolutely right, is that refined carbohydrates are a problem, that highly processed foods are a problem. To me, what they get wrong is thinking that animal products are not an issue at all. And I again, if you look back at Paleolithic anthropology, nutritional anthropology, and the estimates of what people actually consumed in Paleolithic times, one of the things that's really interesting is that these estimates certainly indicated that these diets were fairly high in protein, so around 25-30% of calories from protein, which is what these new paleo folks do as well. However, the predictions around fat were a lot lower in fat than a lot of the lower carb diets today. So they were estimating some 20 to, as high as 35% fat, but probably at the lower end for most of humanity, for most of the Paleolithic period. In fact, the first 80% of the Paleolithic people, humans were, or the Paleolithic period, humans were essentially vegetarian. We didn't know how to hunt. If there was something dead, we might try to, take a bite out of it, but we didn't have the real capacity to kill anything of any size. And it was only in the last 20% of the Paleolithic period that we learned how to hunt. And even then, these folks that have done this research said that even then, we were predominantly plant-based. And certainly people near the equator ate mostly plants. As you moved further north, so you increase the amount of hunting to provide enough food. But even the biggest hunters on the planet were averaging 70 grams of fiber a day. That's more than the average vegan eats. So they were eating a fair bit of fibrous plant matter. The averages, the estimates were 150 plus grams of fiber for people at the other end of the scale eating more plants. So I don't know of anybody eating a paleo diet today that comes anywhere close. And if you look at the estimates for things like vitamin C, 500 or 600 milligrams a day, that's probably more than the average vegan. It's way more than the average omnivore, and it's certainly far above what any paleo inclined person would consume. Potassium, 7,000, 10,000, the numbers vary a bit, but again, vegans don't even get that. Where does potassium come from? Fruits and vegetables. So over and over and over again, we have indications that the diet had a lot of plants. The other thing to know is animals consumed by Paleolithic man were certainly much lower in environmental contaminants, if not free of environmental contaminants, and they were extremely lean. So you're looking at an estimated percentage of calories from fat ranging from 6 to 16% of calories. Today's domestic animals are closer to 40, even 50% of calories from fat, and the very high fat products even higher. And so they're very different. These are not the same things. And if you look at domestic animals, well, we know these persistent organic pollutants move up the food chain. They're often pumped full of hormones and antibiotics. There are all kinds of factors that affect the healthfulness of meat today. Now, we've got a number of studies that have looked at and compared people eating, various amounts of carbohydrates. And consistently, the people eating the least carbohydrates have about somewhere in the range of 26 to 32% higher mortality rates. The most interesting, I think, of these studies was a recent study that came out by Seidelman's group. And in fact, what they found was that the highest rates of mortality occurred in people consuming the least carbohydrates. They had a 32% increase in mortality. Now, the lowest mortality was associated with people consuming about 50 to 55% of calories from carbohydrate. And then in the high carbohydrate range, it was just fascinating because on average they had a 23% higher risk than people at the lowest end, but the range within that category was absolutely huge. So the bulk of the people that had an increased mortality that you could see on this chart was significantly increased. The researchers explained that these people were getting most of their carbohydrates from refined foods. These were people in poor countries that were relying on white flour, white rice products as their primary source of calories. Now, within that same category, we saw the very lowest mortality rates, and we would expect that that category of high carbohydrate eaters were getting their carbohydrates from whole plant foods. Now, the other thing that Seidelman's study showed is if you replace carbohydrate with animal fat or protein, you increase, and you will actually increase mortality by 18%. But if you replace carbohydrate with plant fat or protein, you reduce mortality by 18%. And so this is very consistent in the literature. We've seen multiple studies showing that plant-predominant diets are protective for the human species.
Why do you say the optimal level of alcohol is 0? Aren't there studies saying red wine is good for you?
When it comes to alcohol, the research that shows that red wine is good for you, I'm a little suspicious of. My guess is they are comparing people who drink lots of red wine with people who don't drink, who are former alcoholics, who were former alcoholics. And so they have a lot of health issues. So they're not necessarily comparing them to healthy individuals who are, non-drinkers. And so I'm suspecting that. I'm not positive of it, but I think we have to be very careful of that research because we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that any amount of alcohol increases cancer risk. And it's really simple. Alcohol is helping carcinogens get into cells. It eases the entrance, if you will, of carcinogens into cells. It also speeds the oxidative stress. It creates free radical reactions. And so we know that there is no amount of alcohol intake that is helpful in terms of cancer, and any amount is harmful. We know that alcohol can also increase risk of, liver disease, and there are other adverse health effects associated with excess alcohol consumption. So in my view, the optimal intake of alcohol is 0. If you drink, you definitely want to keep it moderate, and that means on occasion and in moderation. I don't know that there's anything wrong with having a small glass of wine once in a while, but I'm not sure it's a good idea to make it something you do every evening, and something you do. I can remember so many, when I was a young person, so many of the adults I knew, it was a drink before dinner, like a rye and ginger or something. It was a glass of wine with supper, and it was an after dinner little liqueur or something after supper, and that was standard. And this is just not a good plan. So I think for, just for most people, the less, the better.
Brian Clement says all sugar, including fruit, feeds yeast, mold, and fungus, and that we should eat only around a piece a day. Do you agree with this? What have you observed in people's blood sugar levels when they ate or did not eat fruit?
Well, I have a different experience, and I know Brian's basing his recommendations on his experience at Hippocrates and working with cancer patients, and I appreciate that. But based on science, we come up with something quite different. And even my experience working with, I work more with diabetes than with cancer. I just don't see that. But if you go on PubMed, this is where the research is available to everyone, and you do a search, fruit and health, or fruit and heart disease, or fruit and cancer, or fruit and diabetes, whatever you search, you can't find negative studies. They are non-existent. As a matter of fact, 2018, there was a research team that published a meta-analysis of 356 studies on the relationship between fruit and disease. And basically what they said is that fruit consistently reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, various types of cancer, depression, osteoporosis, skin disorders, GI disorders, just a laundry list of diseases. It was quite amazing. And then their conclusion is that they're recognizing that fruit is contributing, the lack of fruit, that low fruit intake is a very significant contributor to global morbidity and mortality, and that we need to be putting more emphasis on it based on 356 research studies. In terms of looking at what it does to blood glucose, there was a study from Denmark not so long ago that compared very low fruit intake with higher fruit intake, and they saw no differences in terms of glycemic response in the individuals. Fruit didn't have an adverse effect, and they said that fruit absolutely should not be restricted. There were 2 studies that I know of that looked at giving people 20 servings of fruit a day, and even then they saw improvements in cholesterol and triglycerides and all of these things that were fairly surprising to the researchers. There are a couple of folks that run this, Cirrus and Robbie, that run the Mastering Diabetes site, and they promote a very fruit-heavy diet for people with diabetes, and their results have just been stellar. So a lot of us who have been hesitant to include too much fruit in the diet are recognizing that it's probably not such a big issue. And I have to say, from a personal perspective, I've always been a heavy fruit eater. Even as a child, my mom would buy a basket of peaches and they would be gone in a day and a half. I would eat 3 or 4 at the time. I would eat, blueberries, just bowls, bowls full. And so I'm a little bit partial to fruit. I love fruit, but I think it's a wonderful source of potassium. I can remember when we were analyzing our menus for our Becoming Vegan books, we actually had a hard time getting potassium up to where it needed to be without including a significant amount of fruit. I think for most people, eating 2 or 3 or 4 or even more servings of fruit a day is not a problem.
How do you reverse type 2 diabetes? Can everyone do it, or does it only work for some people?
So the whole question of the reversal of diabetes is such an interesting one, because most people who have been through medical school, been through nursing school, been through dietetic school, learn that diabetes is not a reversible disease. And it's probably only been in the last maybe 15 years that that's been on our radar, maybe 20. I think James Anderson's work in the 70s and 80s gave us some hints that it was a reversible disease. But certainly many health professionals still believe that it's a progressive irreversible disease. But there are a couple of things they need to know. Number one is, in 2009, the American Diabetes Association released a paper defining diabetes reversal. And they defined it as, number one, people would be on no medications. Number two, they would have normal glycemic measures, normal A1Cs, normal fasting glucose. And number three, they would maintain this for at least a year. Now that's the part that's controversial, at least a year. Some folks will say 3 months is enough, 6 months is enough. But what we know is they need to be off medications and have normal glycemic measures. And if they have that, if they don't have a fasting blood sugar of 126 milligrams per deciliter, they're not diabetic. If they don't have, A1Cs in the diabetic range, they're not diabetic. And yes, it's true, they could become diabetic again quite easily if they revert to their old ways and regain the weight and so forth. But diabetes is a reversible disease. I have seen many people reverse this disease. And so how do we reverse it? Well, number one, we need to understand diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a disease of insulin resistance. So in most people, the pancreas is still functioning, which is not true in type 1 diabetes, where the beta cells have been mainly destroyed or completely destroyed. And in type 2 diabetes, the beta cells are often still functioning. Now they can become less well functioning, and we can lose some over time because of this, constant overuse and trying to put out so much insulin to compensate for high blood sugars that the pancreas can literally conk out eventually. But for most people, there is function in that pancreas. So what we need to do is we need to reverse insulin resistance. So what causes insulin resistance? Well, insulin resistance, I think, is a function of several things. So one of which is overweight and obesity. Overweight and obesity cause inflammation because you get this production of adipokines or cytokines that are these inflammatory compounds, especially from your visceral fat stores, that contribute to insulin resistance. You get oxidative stress, which again contributes to inflammation and insulin resistance. And then the other two really key players are dysbiosis. Dysbiosis in of itself is an unhealthy gut flora, and you can get production of these inflammatory compounds that leak into the bloodstream. Your gut becomes leaky, and these things get into the bloodstream and again can contribute to insulin resistance and endotoxemia and all of these things. And then the biggie, which many people are completely unaware of, is called lipotoxicity. And this is the kingpin. So lipotoxicity is a situation where you begin to store fat in places where it should not be. So fat, we have this unlimited ability to store fat. And it is normally stored in our adipose tissue. And adipose tissue can just keep storing and storing and storing and storing. However, when excess calories are coming in at such a high rate that the body can't shuttle it off to the fat stores fast enough, it sometimes ends up worming its way into places it shouldn't be. Your liver, your pancreas, your heart tissue, and your muscle tissue. And that is lipotoxicity. When you store fat in your pancreas, it kills your beta cells. When you store fat in your liver, it makes your body highly insulin resistant. When you store fat in your muscle tissue, and of course, we all store some fat in our muscle tissue in something called intramuscular lipids. And if you're an athlete, you actually even have more of these because you need that fast burning fuel to be readily available to your muscles. But in people who are overweight and diabetic, they get so much fat shoved into their muscle tissue that their muscle tissue becomes very insulin resistant. And so the intramuscular lipids can actually block insulin signaling. And this is a huge issue. And so what we see is that as people begin to lose weight, start eating more healthfully, and their body fat comes down, the lipotoxicity starts to decline. And in fact, one of the first clues we had that insulin resistance could be, could be reversed was in people undergoing bariatric surgery. So they would undergo bariatric surgery, and the weight loss would happen very, very rapidly. And within a week or two, their insulin resistance was gone because one of the first places that they would burn the fat off was from their liver. And once you get liver fat down, you restore insulin sensitivity. So that was clue number one. And then these groups started to say, well, I wonder if we could get the same thing if we just put people on a really strict, like super low calorie, 600 to 800 calorie diet, giving them these liquid beverages, and that's it. And sure enough, lipotoxicity came down and insulin resistance went away. And then the third sort of level of evidence we now have is people consuming these whole food, plant-based diets. And it's a more gradual reduction of lipotoxicity, but we see it. Dr. Joel Fuhrman did a study. It was a very small study, but these individuals in his study, I believe it was 62% or thereabouts, completely went off medications and reversed their disease. And we have a group that's working on a diabetes program online. It's called the E4 Live Diabetes Solutions. They're seeing numbers about the same in the 60-some% of their folks who are really adherent are seeing complete reversal of the disease. And so this is exciting news. And so we know that by following a diet that doesn't include a lot of processed foods or animal products, that we can see tremendous improvements and restore our insulin sensitivity.
What can someone do to prevent osteoporosis and bone fractures? Do you recommend we take calcium tablets?
So osteoporosis is, first of all, it's not a dairy deficiency disease, as so many people think it is. It's not even a calcium deficiency disease. It is a multifactorial disease that, there are so many factors that affect our risk. And if you look around the world, you see people in Africa who are eating 400 milligrams of calcium a day, who have some of the strongest bones in the world. But they are doing tons of weight-bearing exercise. They're super conditioned to absorb the calcium they eat very efficiently. The rest of their diet is designed to really maximize bone health. So calcium is important, not to get the wrong idea. Calcium is very important, but so are other minerals. Potassium, magnesium, boron, zinc, they're all important to bone health. Vitamin D is critical for the absorption of calcium, but it's not just vitamin D, it's vitamin B12. It's vitamin K, it's vitamin E. They're all important to bone health. And so there are many factors that come into play: essential fatty acids, protein, the intake of fruits and vegetables. There are just so many factors that come into play. If we look at people who eat a vegan diet, and not necessarily an optimal vegan diet, just a vegan diet, and look at their bone health, we see about half the studies showing not much difference with people eating an omnivorous diet. The other half showing that vegans have less bone density, which is not a good thing. Now, one of the key studies was Epic Oxford that showed that vegans in this particular study had about 30% more fractures than omnivores. And this was very concerning, but they went on and looked a little further. And they looked only at the vegans that were eating at least 525 milligrams of calcium a day. They had no differences in their bone mineral or in their fracture risk compared to omnivores, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, fish eaters. They were all about the same. So for vegans, it seems that it makes sense to make sure you're getting at least 525 milligrams a day. Now, it matters. A lot of things you do matter. So the amount of salt you eat, the amount of protein you eat, all of these, how much you exercise, will all factor in. So people eating a whole food, a sort of SOS, if you will, type of diet where they're not adding a lot of salt or not adding any salt, they may be able to get by with slightly lower calcium intakes than someone eating more sodium, for example. But I think it's still not a bad idea to aim for the recommended intakes. And the RDA for calcium is 1,000 milligrams for people 19 to 50 years of age. For women 50 to, I think it's 70, it would be, or 51 to 70, it goes up to 1,200, and for men 70 plus, it goes up to 1,200. And so people say, how do you get that much calcium on a plant-based diet? It seems like so much. For years, people have thought you have to have dairy to get that much calcium. But in fact, if you look back at the Paleolithic diet, the estimated calcium intakes were 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams a day. And so they didn't consume the milk of any other mammals. Can you imagine? People didn't have that capacity back then. So where did they get it? Well, they got it from leafy greens. They got it from all of these plant foods they were eating. Some of it may have come from bones as well, but most of it from plant foods. And so we can do that too. So greens are a really good source of calcium. And in fact, you absorb about maybe 34% of the calcium from cow's milk. It's about the same for tofu, little bit less for soy milk, little bit less for things like sweet potatoes and beans, somewhere in the 20 to 30% range, but a lot more for low oxalate green leafies. So you absorb about 40 to 70% of the calcium in leafy greens, like kale and broccoli. Well, broccoli, Chinese greens, turnip greens, all of these greens, collard greens, are sort of a little lower but reasonable amount. There are 3 greens that are really high in calcium, but you can't get a lot of calcium out of them because they're so high in oxalic acid. And so that's beet greens, spinach, and Swiss chard. So those are healthy foods, they're great foods, but they're not big calcium sources just because of their oxalic acid content. And so greens are a great source. Tofu made with calcium. All of these fortified non-dairy milks contain very readily available calcium, so they're good calcium sources. And then things like beans, so black turtle beans, navy beans, white, or great northern beans, white beans, they all contain about 100 milligrams of calcium per cup, some a little bit more. And then we have things like seeds. There are many seeds that contain 250 milligrams of calcium per quarter cup. Chia seeds, sesame seeds, poppy seeds are really quite high in calcium. And so we can, almonds are a reasonable source. And you get bits from all sorts of fruits and vegetables. Even an orange has 60 milligrams of calcium. So if you're eating that variety of foods and you're focused a little bit on some of these bigger calcium sources, you can get by pretty well. And it's pretty easy to get 600 or 700 doing that milligrams of calcium, and then you add in 1 serving of fortified milk and you're at the 1,000. You add 2 and you're at, you're at 1,200-1,300 fairly easily. So that's how you can do it. And I think we do need to be conscious of that for children. We do need to be conscious of that for especially, everybody, but for women who are at higher risk for osteoporosis. And so it's totally doable. To me, it defies rationality to assume that the milk of, a cow would be essential for human health. I love what Michael Clapper says. He reminds people that, the milk of a cow, the milk of a moose, the milk of a deer, the milk of a dog, the milk of a cat is beautifully designed to support the life and growth of their offspring. So for a calf that weighs 65 pounds, whatever, at birth, everything in that milk is there in order to help that little calf become a full-grown cow. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't needed for that purpose. And so to think that the human species requires that milk for their survival or their bone health or anything else is ridiculous. We no more need cow's milk than moose milk. Moose milk actually has twice as much calcium as cow's milk per cup. We don't call it an essential food. So not that cow's milk is not a rich source of calcium. Of course it is. It's got to make some pretty big bones and little calves. It's 300 milligrams per cup. It's a rich source of calcium, but it doesn't make it an essential source of calcium for people.
What do you recommend for women who are perimenopausal or menopausal to help them deal with the side effects of menopause?
Well, for people who are going through menopause, it's so interesting. If you look around the world, there are some places where the symptoms of menopause are very unusual, or we just don't see them much. And one of the places I think of is Japan, whereas in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, people experience more profound symptoms of menopause. And I think a lot has to do with body weight and hormones. I think a lot has to do with our dietary choices. And I think a lot has to do with our exercise habits. And so to me, I would say to women, be as healthy as you can be. Don't be overweight. Get enough rest. Get enough exercise, and eat an unprocessed whole food diet as much as possible. Lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of legumes, plenty of whole grains, some nuts and seeds. We need the essential fats in there as well. And I think that soy, there are several studies showing that it may help reduce symptoms of menopause for some women. And I can just share from a personal perspective, because I'm 61 years old. I'm postmenopausal, of course, and I really barely noticed. Once in a while I felt a little bit of sort of warmth, never what I would call a hot flash where I felt like I was sweating, not even close. That was it. And I am a regular consumer of organic soy. And some people say, oh, soy's poison, don't eat that. My answer to that would be, if soy was a poison, it probably wouldn't have been a dietary staple in two of the healthiest, longest lived zones in the world, Okinawa and the Seventh Day Adventist. Okinawans average 2 servings of soy a day. Soy is a legume, it's a bean. It's to me, it's a wonderful contributor to very wonderful protein-rich food, and great for people who are vegetarian or vegan. And so what I would say is that we need to be cautious about ultra-processed soy and how is the soy protein extracted, and ask those questions. If you just stick to organic, you can avoid some of the issues we might be concerned with. And so organic soy, tofu, tempeh, edamame, soybeans used to make patties or whatever you're doing with it. And those would be, and even organic soy milk. To me, those are very reasonable additions to the diet. I would go a little more lightly on the processed soy foods like the veggie meats, but I still don't think they need to be necessarily eliminated, because I feel like they make doing this easier for people. Isn't it wonderful when, your child is going off to a scouting adventure and they can have a hot dog on the fire like everyone else. So they have a tofu hot dog, or they have a veggie burger when the troop is doing burgers. It just makes life easier for people. And so I think they can have a place in the diet. And just, I wouldn't make them staples, that's all. So I think those are the keys. And for me, and for many women I know who are plant-based, we pretty much sailed through menopause.
According to the best unbiased science, does replacing animal protein with plant protein reduce risk of death and disease?
Yes, so this question, there are a couple of studies that I think are worth mentioning. So the first study was a Harvard study that I mentioned earlier, and this Harvard study it did exactly that, replacing animal protein with plant protein. And as I mentioned, we saw a risk reduction in terms of mortality that was very, very significant. So we know that with this particular study, 130,000 individuals followed for 30 years, replacing just 3%, that's about 60 calories in a 2,000 calorie diet, with plant protein, reduced risk of death by 34% if you were replacing processed meat, 19% with eggs, 12% with unprocessed meat, 8% with dairy, 6% with fish and poultry. Now there was a second study that just came out in 2019 from Japan, and the numbers were unbelievable. So you're looking at, again, replacing 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein. They saw a 34% reduction in mortality if it came from red meat, and a 42% reduction in mortality if it came from processed meat. They also looked at cancer. 46% reduction in cancer with unprocessed red meat, and a 50% reduction in cancer with processed red meat. And we're talking about 3% of calories. That is phenomenal results. And there are many other studies that have looked at this and consistently show, for almost every disease you can think of, for cancers, for diabetes, for heart disease, that replacing animal protein with plant protein reduces risk.
You mentioned the Seventh Day Adventist. Can you explain more about their health study and what its conclusions were? Was this study an important one?
Well, first I'll say this study is one of the most important studies for the plant-based world as far as I'm concerned, and I should qualify that statement. This is not one study. This is dozens and dozens of studies. So first of all, we had the Adventist mortality study, and this was a study many years ago that actually just compared Adventists with other people in California. This was the Loma Linda Adventists with other, people doing the standard thing in California, and they found that the Adventists were at a tremendous advantage in terms of longevity and various diseases. And then they did the Adventist Health Study 1, and that looked at, well, why? What is it that gives Adventists the advantage? And so they found that, it was exercise. it was smoking less. It was you know, just all of these things, but it was also diet and eating a more plant-strong diet that provided the protection in this case. And then the biggie, the Adventist Health Study 2. And this study began in 2002 and is still ongoing, 96,000 individuals. And what they did in this study is they compared just Adventists, but the Adventists who eat meat with the Adventists who are semi-vegetarian, who are pesco-vegetarian or basically follow a vegetarian diet plus fish, who are lacto-ovo-vegetarian, so they eat eggs and milk, versus the vegans, and followed them for many years to see who within this cohort actually develops disease. And so it's such a fair comparison because they all tend to, they control for, you know, how much coffee do you drink? How much do you exercise? How much alcohol do you drink? How much do you smoke? That's all controlled for. These are all health conscious individuals. And so when you compare the meat eaters with the vegans, the differences you're looking at are the differences in what their diet is like. And the one thing I have to say is the Adventist meat eaters eat a lot less meat than the general population. So we're looking at smaller intakes of meat. So it makes the findings even more impressive in my view. And what did they find? Well, they found that compared to the meat-eating Adventists, the vegans had 62% less diabetes. They had 16% less cancer. They had 75% less hypertension. The men had, you know, I think it was 42% less heart disease. They had about, the vegetarians and vegans combined, about half the rates of kidney disease. And it just goes on. They're finding that people eating plant-based had a really significant advantage over the people eating animal products. And so yes, a very important study, and we can expect to see more, you know, reports from this cohort as time goes on.
Do you recommend people avoid whole grains that have gluten, like wheat, barley, and oats?
No, I think that there are some people that do need to avoid gluten-containing grains, and those are people that are somewhere on the gluten sensitivity spectrum. And that may be 6% of the population. It's still debatable, but certainly people with celiac disease who are very sensitive have to avoid all gluten. But people on the spectrum, some can have small amounts of these grains if they're sprouted. Some can have, you know, different, just they can manage oats, but not, you know, other, I mean, oats technically don't contain gluten, but they can cause sensitivity because they're often processed on equipment that has had gluten-containing grains on it. And so they can be contaminated because of that. But generally what I would say is if you are not sensitive to gluten, there's absolutely no reason to avoid those grains. And in fact, I think they're some of the best grains we can eat. They're very high in fiber, they're very satiating, they're very nutritious. Barley has tremendous amount of soluble fiber. There's all sorts of advantages to them. Now, the one thing that I would say is we do need to be aware that for some people who, you know, I've met a number of people who say, for some reason I react to these grains when I'm in the States or Canada, but I go off to Europe and I can eat bread. It's weird. And I think in those cases it may be actually glyphosate they're responding to and not gluten per se. And so glyphosate is a chemical in Roundup, and it's sprayed on several crops to expedite the drying of those crops so that they can be harvested more quickly. And so to me it makes no sense that we're spraying poison on our food. It just doesn't make sense. But we do that, and the amounts of glyphosates in a number of cereal products and other grain-based products can actually be quite significant, quite concerning. And so how do you avoid that? By just eating organic grains. So if you buy flour, buy organic. If you buy the intact grains, which is mostly what I buy kamut berries organic, I buy spelt berries organic, I buy oat groats organic. And so I get these foods organic, and then you don't have to worry so much about this particular issue. But generally, I would say, I love kamut berries, I love spelt berries, I love barley. One of my favorite barleys is black barley, which is just a little higher in the phytochemicals, and it sprouts beautifully. And I think these foods can be a wonderful addition to the diet.
Explain what the Taiwanese health study was and what its conclusions were. Was this study an important one?
Well, the Taiwanese health study, also called the Suchi Health Study, is a very important study. And again, it's not just one study, it's several studies. And so this is a series of studies that compares about 6,000 people who are Taiwanese Buddhists, some of whom are meat eaters and some of whom are vegetarian. And so they're comparing the vegetarians with the non-vegetarians and looking at their rates of disease. And the lead person on a lot of these studies is a personal friend. Her name is Tina Chu. And she went to school at Loma Linda to do her master's, went on to she's Taiwanese, she went on back to Taiwan, did her PhD, has since become a professor, and she is a very strong ethical vegan. And a wonderful presenter. She'll actually be at the Plantrition Project Conference in September and be speaking and sharing a lot more about these studies. But these studies have shown that the vegetarians, the men had 51% less diabetes, the women 75% less, lower rates of gout, lower rates of hypertension, lower rates of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I just received the brand new study. Tina always sends me the studies just as they're being released on urinary tract infections, a significant reduction in that as well. So very important study and very interesting results as well.
Explain the results of the health professionals follow-up study, and why do you like this study?
So the health professionals follow-up study, I'm going to combine two studies in here because they're so tightly related. So Harvard has done two series of studies. One is called the Nurses' Health Study, and one is called the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And in these studies, so let's start with the Nurses' Health Study. Again, it's not one study. I would guess, I know for the health professionals it was over 1,000 studies. And it's very similar for the Nurses' Health Study. And then they combined both for some studies, looking at, the men and women combined. So the Nurses' Health Study is women, and the health professionals was men. And so out of Harvard, what they did was they've done a number of interviews with these cohorts. And actually the Nurses' Health Study, there have been 3 cohorts. One in 1976, one in 89, and one in 2010. So all total, we're talking about 280,000 people. And for the health professionals follow-up study, it's about 50,000 individuals. So these are big numbers of people, and what they do is they find out, what do you eat, what do you drink, how much do you smoke, what's your lifestyle like, and then they look at them over time to see who develops what disease. And these studies are extremely important because they have really, and this is no exaggeration, they have helped us tremendously create nutrition policy that will help reduce the risk of chronic disease in this country. And so they have informed nutrition policy, essentially. And so very, very important studies. And what they've shown is that, people should not be smoking. People should not be drinking much alcohol. People should be eating more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more legumes, less red meat especially, less refined carbohydrates. So they've been giving us these big picture kinds of answers to health and chronic disease. And so yes, very important studies. And one of our speakers here at this conference is Dr. Walter Willett, who is, at the helm of these studies. So very important.
According to the best unbiased science, is there a clear relation between consuming beef and heart disease, cancer, and diabetes?
Oh, absolutely. So no question, beef is associated with these diseases, and particularly we see, saturated fat and heart disease, of course, and beef is a significant source of saturated fat. So we see a link there. We see a link with diabetes as well, but probably the biggest connection is with colorectal cancer. And so in fact, if that red meat is processed, so beef being processed, we actually have very convincing evidence that it is a group 1 human carcinogen. And a lot of people make the mistake thinking that because it's in the same group 1 carcinogens include smoking or tobacco, asbestos, alcohol. These are group 1 human carcinogens, and so is processed meat. But it doesn't mean that processed meat is as bad as smoking. And I think that's important for people to understand. What this does is it says the evidence against processed meat is convincing. It doesn't give us sort of the level of carcinogenicity in the, comparing that to smoking. It doesn't do that. So we don't know if smoking's at 10 where, processed meat would lie. We just know that we have convincing evidence that it is a human carcinogen, particularly where colorectal cancer is concerned. Now with red meat that's unprocessed, we have probable evidence, which puts it in what we call a group 2A category. So it's not as strong evidence, but it's still fairly substantial evidence that it is a probable carcinogen.
Explain what the EPIC Oxford Health study was and what its conclusions were, and was this an important study?
So EPIC Oxford was also a very important study. So this was a study that is from the UK, where we had about 65,000 health-conscious individuals who were being followed. They were actually recruited between 1993 and 1999 and have been being followed ever since. And so there are multiple papers on this particular cohort. And this cohort is interesting because I think it's not quite as healthy of a cohort as the Adventist Health Study 2, where the Adventist Health Study 2, they have a little higher intake of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and they tend to make sure they get enough B12, and they're a little more conscious and more informed where diet is concerned than I think the folks in EPIC Oxford. But nonetheless, EPIC Oxford found that vegans have 40% fewer cataracts than similar health-conscious non-vegetarians. That vegetarians and vegans have less, less diabetes, less heart disease. They've had a number of different reports. One report, I think it was about 32% less. Or vegans had about 19% less cancer, and they've looked at diverticular disease, and I believe it was 72% less for vegans and 27% less for lacto-ovo-vegetarians. So they've looked at a number of diseases, and generally, not 100%, but generally, the vegetarians and vegans are at an advantage. So very important study, and it's still ongoing.
Is the phrase "eat everything in moderation" a good way for people to stay healthy?
I love this question. It's, moderation is important in life. I think we need to be moderate. I love that the Okinawans are so moderate. They have this saying, "Heri hachi bu," which means eat only till you're 80% full, eat moderately. But in our society, moderation it's tricky, because if everything you do in moderation is bad for you, it will still kill you. And that's the case for many North Americans. So the moderation message, you know, if you think about corporations who are selling whatever processed food they're making, and they're funding Nutrition Month, or they're funding, you know, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Association's nutrition education, or whoever they're funding, the Medical Association, whatever. They will not be happy with messages that tell people to eat fewer of their products. So that eat less message, they're not going to be willing to fund whatever it is that's going on. However, the moderation message, they'll be willing to fund. Eat everything in moderation. All foods can fit in a healthy diet. There are no good foods, no bad foods. It just all fits. And we need to be really cautious of that, because when 70% of us die of chronic diseases that are induced by overconsumption, and when 70% of the population is either overweight or obese, and it's rising, the moderation message we need to be very careful of, because what it says to people is, oh, it's okay to eat your deep-fried pork rinds, just eat them in moderation. No problem, drink your Coke, just drink it in moderation. That's not what people in North America need to hear. They need to hear, eat less of this crap, you know, and eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more beans, eat more of the foods that will actually promote and sustain health, eat more green leafy vegetables. That's what they need to hear. So I think moderation is, to me, be very cautious. Yes, do things in moderation, but don't do all of these bad things in moderation, because you'll just die a little more slowly than you would otherwise.
Why does Finland have so much more heart disease than Japan?
Well, though that's starting to change, but it's very interesting. Finland has, we know, when we look at, there was a study done that kind of vindicated saturated fat by Chowdhury in 2014. At least they claimed it vindicated saturated fat. I don't think it did at all, because what it did was it compared people it compared people in Japan who were eating 5% saturated fat with people in Japan eating 6% saturated fat. It compared people in Finland eating 12% saturated fat with people in Finland eating 14% saturated fat. And what it found was, well, gosh, there wasn't that big of a difference in those Japanese that were eating that, small, but if they would have compared the people from Japan with the people in Finland, bingo! The people in Finland, their rates of heart disease were through the roof, whereas the people in Japan didn't have much heart disease. And I think the big issue is people in Japan tend to eat fairly plant-based. Their diet is carbohydrate heavy. They tend to eat a lot of rice and a lot of vegetables, and they tend to not overeat. There's not a lot of dairy there, so there's not cheese and ice cream and all of these things as much as what you would find in a place like Finland, where they eat a lot of processed meat, a lot of dairy, and a lot of meat, period. So I think that's really the clue.
Should we eat oils such as flax, hemp, olive oil? Are they helpful or hurtful?
There's so much controversy in the plant-based movement about oils and whether they hurt or help. And my personal feeling is that all macronutrients, it doesn't matter if it's fat, carbohydrate, or protein, they are all best coming from whole foods. So I would sooner see a person getting their fat from flax seeds rather than flax oil, or from olives rather than olive oil, or avocados rather than avocado oil. I would, I guess, make an analogy to rather see a person getting their sugar from fruit rather than from a concentrated sweetener. Because making an oil involves processing, which removes a lot of the food parts of the food that's really beneficial, the fiber and phytochemicals and so on. Now, again, the quality of oil depends on how you process it. So some fresh pressed, first pressing, extra virgin olive oil, or extra, the cold pressed flaxseed oil, or these kinds of oils, I would say if people use them, they should be used like these concentrated sweeteners as a little flavoring in food, and not as a component that has a lot of volume. And also there are some cases where these foods may be valuable. And so, for example, in a small child who's having difficulty eating enough and growing, adding a little bit of a more concentrated fat can help the child gain weight. Or for an athlete who needs 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day and just can't take in a big volume of food, it's a way to add calories without adding volume. And our our needs for fats, it's not the same for every individual. I think some people who have these long, lanky bodies who just can't gain weight, they do better with a little more fat in their diet than people who, walk by the bakery and gain 5 pounds. So there are some people that are much better with a lot less fat. People with heart disease will want to consume less fat. And so it's very individual, but I think we really want to get our macronutrients more from whole foods than from oils. If we use oils, we want them to be minimized, to be used very carefully, never to hit a smoke point if they're being used in cooking. Better to use them not in cooking, to be honest. I would actually, honestly, I would say that I would sooner see a person, and people are going to just cringe when I say this, who are SOS, but I would sooner see a person put a little bit of high quality oil and balsamic vinegar on a salad than put a dead sugar dressing. And a lot of these no fat dressings on the market are just sugar. And sugar has no redeeming value. There's nothing there. Whereas oil may have some redeeming value. Flax oil has some omega-3s. Oils have some vitamin E. If they're fresh pressed, they may actually still contain some phytochemicals and antioxidants. They may contain a bit of vitamin K. There's some redeeming value. They actually help the phytochemicals in our salads to be better absorbed. The sugar does nothing. So the way that I make dressings is using whole foods. I might use an avocado or some tahini or some walnuts or some nuts or seeds to make my whole food dressing, and that to me is ideal. But if I had to choose between one or the other, I would choose the dressing that has a little bit of really high quality oil rather than the dead sugar dressing.
What's wrong with eating dairy products?
Well, eating dairy products, again, many of the blue zones include dairy products and have had these animals where they use the dairy products and maintain really good health over time. To me, the biggest problem with consuming dairy products in our culture is for the cows. And I mean, there are problems for people too, don't get me wrong. But when you look at what we do to cows to steal their milk, the rape racks, the taking their babies away from them, it is beyond belief that we would do that to another sentient being. I can think of nothing that could justify that kind of treatment and the way we enslave them and put them through that, pregnancy after pregnancy and at the end of their 4 years where their milk production starts to wane, they go to the hamburger factory. I just can't justify that. And when we think about the environmental consequences of cattle and cows for milk and cattle for beef, it makes no sense in this current environment. And in terms of health, there are 70% of the human population is lactose intolerant. Humans naturally, their lactase enzyme diminishes as they hit about 4 years of age. And so most of the human population can't even tolerate it. And for those that consume it, it can contribute to acne. It can contribute to arthritis. It can certainly contribute to prostate cancer and possibly ovarian cancer. And so there are all kinds of, it's one of our richest sources of saturated fat. So it's a potential contributor to heart disease. And so the list goes on. And so I think humans absolutely are better off getting the nutrients that you would get from cow's milk from other places.
What about plant foods makes them protective against disease?
So why are plant foods protective? There are so many factors in plants. So when you look at research, there are a number of compounds that we see over and over again that are associated with health benefits. One of them is fiber. And there are many different types of fibers in plants, and fiber helps to protect against every disease. It's absolutely critical for our gut microbiome. It's their food. And a healthy gut microbiome affects everything. It affects our brain. It affects everything. And so we don't give them their food. We end up with dysbiosis, with a very unhealthy gut microbiome. So that's critical. Fiber helps us to reduce our risk of various cancers. It helps to reduce risk of diabetes, heart disease. It's just so important to health. And then we've got phytochemicals. These are plant chemicals that are there in plants to protect the plants against predators and to help the plants thrive. And when humans consume these chemicals, they are anti-inflammatory. They reduce oxidative stress. They kick our enzyme systems that get rid of toxins in our body into high gear. They just do all kinds of things that protect us. Plants are high in antioxidants, which reduce oxidative stress. They're high in sterols and stanols, which can be very protective and help to reduce the absorption of cholesterol, for example. Plant foods are rich in a number of trace minerals and vitamins. They're really the most nutrient-dense foods of all. So when you think about all the compounds in plants that are protective, it just goes on and on. Almost every component that is most protective to human health, the prebiotics and so on and so forth, are concentrated in plant foods. So it's no mystery that they protect human health. It's where all of the protective components are.
What's the best way to improve or heal the gut microbiome?
So the gut microbiome is really best healed and improved by a number of things. So number one, you need to feed the gut bacteria. And what do we feed it? These prebiotics, where do they come from? There are a number of foods that are especially rich in prebiotics. So Jerusalem artichokes, which not very many of us eat, but they're very high in prebiotics. Bananas, onions, garlic, even asparagus, beans, all sorts of plant foods, whole grains, are all providers of prebiotics, or these resistant starches that are food for our bacteria. That's number one. Number two, to consider actually consuming some probiotics, or the bacteria themselves, to ingest some in the form of fermented foods. Number three is to get out of our diet the things that we know are adversely affect the gut microbiome. And so refined carbohydrates are not good news. Alcohol is not good news. Artificial sweeteners are not good news. Meat can shift the gut microbiome in a direction of more, TMA producing bacteria, which produces a compound that gets shuttled to the liver, and we get this production of TMAO, which is quite atherogenic, and so that can contribute to a not so healthy gut microbiome. And of course, there's no fiber in meat either, and so that's not so good. So these are really key players in reestablishing a healthy gut microbiome. And for people that have an unhealthy gut microbiome, sometimes it's a slow, gradual shift, because they can end up, if you just all of a sudden add all of this fiber and beans and all of these things, you don't have the gut microbiome to deal with it. And so sometimes that shift has to be somewhat gradual.
Can you summarize everything we've talked about here today in 15 seconds?
Yes. Eat plants. Eat whole plants that are unprocessed. Make them your dietary staples. Eat fewer processed foods and get rid of animal products in your diet as much as possible. And make sure you get the nutrients you need.
What's the one thing I need to do today?
The one thing you need to do today is educate yourself about the consequences of our choices for ourselves and beyond ourselves. Find out more about the consequences of our food choices for this planet and for the animals that we share this planet with. There are so many resources that are available, many of which you can get right here from the Truth About Health.
What is it about the Real Truth About Health conference that makes you want to come back and speak year after year?
You know, one of the things that I love about this conference is the diverse range of speakers, but the thing that gets me really coming back year after year is simply knowing that even if we have a substantial audience here, that it is reaching so many people all over the world. I don't know how this organization does it, making this amount of information free to the world, but so many people are benefiting and are grateful. And it's changing lives because it's so far-reaching and not costing people anything. So I'm very grateful for that.
For people that want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
Well, I do have a website. It's brendadavisrd.com. I have a presence on Facebook. I'm not very skilled at social media, but I'm trying to learn, and so I do that. And we have a Becoming Vegan Facebook page as well. And of course from my books, and I have 11 books right now, working on the 12th, and I try to get as much of the evidence-based research I can into these books so that people have reliable resources.